My son with autism is 25. He just had a birthday, a quarter century. And I have an older daughter that's a couple of years older than him. But I've been working at the Human Development Institute, which is at UK, for about almost 4 years on the Peer Support Network project. And the Human Development Institute is, every state has a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. The one for Kentucky is housed at UK, and it's called the Human Development Institute. And we developed this project with funding from the Commonwealth Council on Developmental Disabilities. And our project consultant is Eric Carter. He is an assistant professor of special education in Vanderbilt University, but he's very research focused. And he has done so much research on peer supports, peer networks, natural peer supports in general, not just peer support arrangements in schools. So this is a research or evidence-based intervention, which schools are wanting to have more now. It's also virtually no cost to schools. So, and this is a school-based intervention, and I wish we could have had more people from schools here, but it's really hard to get them out on a weeknight, you know, especially my friend that's a teacher, a retired teacher, she's like, this is the worst week of the year, the week of Halloween. Oh. You know, so because they're so excited, and then they'll come back Wednesday and be all drunk on candy, you know. You know, when we talk about people with, well, and then I also want to say that this, we have also collaborated with the Kentucky Autism Training Center, and we've produced a couple of modules that this PowerPoint's based on. We produced one for peer networks and one for peer support arrangements, and I'm going to talk about those. So I'm going to be showing some clips of that video, which we have on our website, and I'll show you that. But, you know, when we think about interventions to support relationships between students, there is a number of different intervention approaches. The two that we focus on is peer support arrangements, which take place in the general ed classroom. It's a school-based intervention, but it's in inclusive general ed classes. It's not students being supported in the special ed classroom. And then peer networks is more of a social intervention that we also facilitate. A lot of you have probably heard of peer tutoring. And that's kind of similar to peer support, but with peer tutoring, it's usually an older, not always, but oftentimes an older student that comes into a classroom and helps a student with a disability, but they're oftentimes getting credit for peer tutoring. And it's a great program in that a lot of students that participate in that go on to become teachers or special ed teachers. And it's a very effective program, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're also not going to talk about peer partner programs, which is like your best buddies, or some high schools have just peer clubs where a bunch of students with disabilities and a bunch of students without disabilities do things together. But the two that we're going to talk about is peer networks and peer support arrangements. So what are they? So the peer network is a social intervention. A peer network typically meets once a week for about 30 minutes. And oftentimes it ends up being at lunchtime because schools used to have some advisory periods and all these different free times throughout the week. Not a lot, but you know, they would have club time or whatever, and you could run a peer network during that time. But schools are really making everything, you know, be about academics and instructional time. So oftentimes lunch is when peer networks are, you know, meet. Typically it's a student with a significant disability along with 3 to 6 peers. In both of these interventions we have facilitators. So in peer networks it can be anybody in the school. And we actually don't necessarily like it to be the special education teacher because we don't want it to be seen necessarily as a special ed thing. And it's a great opportunity to involve other teachers or coaches, and it's really good if you can find one that's kind of popular and it becomes kind of a cool thing. Like I said, they meet weekly, usually 25-30 minutes is about what most kids have for lunch. And they can meet during other times besides lunch, advisory clubs, before or after school, but then transportation becomes a problem. So that's peer networks, and it's all about social interaction and friendship. Peer support arrangements are more about learning and academic engagement. And and you know, just participation in the activities of the class. But of course, we all know that school is a very social thing, so there's going to be some social aspects to peer support arrangements as well. Typically, they're facilitated oftentimes by a paraprofessional. A lot of times, students with significant disabilities may have a paraprofessional that goes with them to the inclusive classroom. And if that's the case, we're going to take the facilitator and move them away from sitting right next to the student all the time and providing all the support, and give them other roles. You know, they can help out with other classmates and do other things. And they are in a more of a facilitative role in the peer support arrangement. And of course, they're going to meet every time the class meets, you know, ideally for the whole class period. And of course, that's, like I said, they're in general education, inclusive classes. So I'm going to, like I said, we have these two videos that Dr. Carter made for us. And I'm going to show that, you know, I think it's about 7 minutes of the peer network intervention one. And I love Dr. Carter. He's really good. And so let's hear what he has to say. Hold on. I did not think about bringing. I wonder how loud this can be. Unfortunately, I did not think about speakers, because we usually present and let me turn mine off. It's all the way up. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Usually where we present, you know, everything's there and it just comes through the speakers. Let me see. This may not be loud enough, although there are subtitles. How come it's not?
Did you flip it around on it?
I'm doing something wrong here. Hold on. How come it's not just...
Is it embedded into your PowerPoint?
Yeah, but I was trying to get at it from another way. If I do it that way, maybe it'll... See, it's not showing it. Do I need to move it? I bet I need to move it.
Whoops.
There it is. Okay.
Oh.
And y'all can't hear that at all, can you? All right. Well, I can talk through it.
This presentation is a joint venture with the Human Development Institute and the Kentucky Autism Training Center.
Oh, I guess we have speakers
So
too.
glad that you joined us. You know, like most people, your memories of school are often marked more by the relationships you developed than by the curriculum you covered. Schools are the social centers of kids' lives, and it's their interactions with friends, with classmates, and with other peers who are attending their school that makes school something they look forward to.
It's over there because I usually have a double screen. You can see it.
Yeah, but I told it not to do that.
Hanging out between classes, enjoying an extracurricular activity, attending a school play or
See, I told it not to do that.
traveling to and from school.
But that's not helping the sound any, is it?
No, that's not going to help the
So
sound.
many opportunities for students to meet one another.
Well, I can just talk through it because I've seen this a
And
number
these
of
social
times.
connections are not insignificant in their impact. We flourish most.
And basically what he's talking about here is,
research affirms what we all know to be so true. That
you know, when you think back to, and this is an exercise we do. This is normally an all-day training, so I've had to cut out a bunch of it. But we ask people, you know, introduce themselves and we say, what is your favorite thing you remember from, let me just turn the volume down on that. You know, what do you remember about school? What's your favorite thing about school? And invariably it's, you know, talking on the bus, walking around between classes, going on band field trips. Hardly anybody says algebra or math, you know, or English class. And so, so the whole point of that is that relationships really matter. And we talk about the old 3 R's and the new 3 R's. You know, the old 3 R's was reading, writing, and arithmetic, which only one of those starts with an R. But the new 3 R's are rigor and relevance. You guys have all heard that, and relationships. And we think relationships are vital. We have some statistics about students with autism in high school and elementary school. And unfortunately, we have this research from the National Transitional Survey, I think from 2015, and it shows, you know, how many people see friends outside of school, how many receive phone calls from friends. How many have been invited to other social events? And for our presentation that we do for not just autism, we look at multiple disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and autism. And autism actually has the worst of those statistics, and it's very low. You know, something like 84% never receive phone calls from friends. It's pretty sad. And so this project attempts to answer some of those problems that students have. And then we talk about the circle of friends. Are y'all familiar with that? Basically, you've got your family, you've got close friends, and then you've got like acquaintances, and then people that are paid to be in your life. What the circle ends up looking like for students with disabilities is, you know, they have family, they have a lot of people to pay to be in their life, their teacher, their doctor, therapist. Everybody's got people paid to be in their life. And we want to increase those two middle circles of friendships and acquaintances. And so, and then we talk about with autism, you know, we often look at the deficit model. But when we're thinking about barriers to friendship, we kind of look at the deficit model of autism. But Dr. Carter is, saying that we should look at the barriers, and the barriers are not all student barriers. What are the barriers to friendships? And I'm just waiting for this to catch up with me, because I really thought Dr. Carter was going to be talking through this whole thing. And what we find is we need to be very intentional. We need to identify the barriers, and then I'm going to talk about some ways that we can address those barriers.
When you do these workshops, who are you doing it with? Teachers?
Typically, teachers and school staff, school teams, ideally school teams.
Any students?
Not very often. And so the types of barriers that we're going to talk about are student-related barriers, peer-related barriers, and then support-related barriers, and that's your adult support or whatever support, and then opportunities. And rather than sit and look at this, I think I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint. Where was it? There's two of these pulled up. Okay. So, and what Dr. Carter's saying is, the reason students may not have friends is not all because of student. Let me resume the slideshow here. There it is. What? Now I'm back on the thing.
It's doing it. It did it. It was coming.
Oh, that was just, okay. All right, I'm just going to go here. And from current slide. Okay. So the video, and these are on our website if you want to view them later. The peer network one is about less than 45 minutes long, I think, and peer support arrangements is less than an hour long. So one thing we talk about in our presentation is the building blocks of friendships. And, it's the first two I think are very self-explanatory. Who are your friends? They're probably people that you do things with, people that you see, people that are in your life on a regular basis. And a lot of times it's, you have common interests, like your friends also like to watch UK play, or you're also, you like to garden, or you have photography in common. And some of the other ones are a little bit less intuitive, so I'm going to talk about those. And also, these different building blocks can help ameliorate some of these barriers. Shared activities can ameliorate opportunity-related barriers where students just don't have a chance to share time together. Common interests can bring students with disabilities and their peers together. And our project is also designed for students with significant communication needs, so that's a very important thing to consider. Valued social roles, I'm going to talk about that. It's one of my favorite topics. And then, of course, we need to orient the students to being in, what's it like to be in a peer network or a peer support arrangement. Provide just enough support. And of course, we always want to reflect on what we're doing. So we go through an exercise with the school where we look at each of those 7 building blocks. And we give them time to think about each one. What's going really well right now in our school, and what are some things we can improve on. So it's not, our intervention is not like, you have to do this, 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 and this. We want them to look and see where they are as a school and how they can make it work in their school. So, of course, the first building block is shared activities. Are students with and without disabilities in the same place at the same time, and are they doing the same activity? So, for example, in the cafeteria, yeah, they're all eating lunch in the cafeteria, but are we bringing the students with disabilities down early and taking them out, or taking them out late because we think it's too overwhelming for them? And if we are, they're in the same place and doing the same activity, but they might not be there exactly the same time as their peers. And so that's just part of the picture we need to evaluate. The same if they're in a classroom at the same place and the same time, but if they're sitting in the back with a paraprofessional working on a worksheet and the other students are involved in a discussion, then that's not really a shared activity. So the second one is common interests, and how do we connect our students? What does our student like to do for fun? What TV shows do they like? What music do they like? What do they like to do for fun? And are there other people in the school that also like some of these same things? And we actually have this, I've got these handouts up here which you guys are free to look at. We have developed a little interest inventory. Yeah, you can go ahead and pass these out if you want to. The orange one's going to be the next one up, so if you want to go ahead and pass that one. And some schools have something like
Thank you.
a listing of all their, like I know Lafayette had a little booklet with all their classes, or extracurricular things. So you might just say, oh, there's an anime club here. I didn't even know that. A lot of times the special education teachers may not be aware of everything the school has to offer. So if your school has something like this, that's a great resource. So are we, are kids sharing activities? Are we connecting them on the basis of common interest? The third building block is a way to communicate. And our project was designed for students with the most significant disabilities. It's not exclusive to students with the most significant disabilities, but we wanted students with significant disabilities to be able to participate. And one big thing is communication. Do we support students to know each other, or do we just use their AAC devices to do school-related things? So, some things, we know that peers provide a motivation to want to communicate, and if you're learning to communicate, they really go hand in hand. We actually have another project at HDI called Talk, and it's teaching age-appropriate academic learning via communication. And another person on the project with me, Luann Land, is actually on Talk too. So if you do have, know of somebody that, could use a communication system, they do great work. It's really good if you have a student that needs a lot of help in that area.
Do they provide it? Do they do the assessments and do
They do the assessments, they let you try stuff out. I don't know if they do have a lot of, yes, like laminated type stuff, because they believe in multimodal communication. It's not going to always be the iPad, you're not always going to have access to. So they do a lot of really cool, like laminated, like core boards, and I never heard of that before. I have learned a lot about communication working with this project.
core boards?
Core boards is like your core things you talk about, and then your French boards. It's like just like a laminated board with a lot of verbs on it and a lot of pronouns, not very many nouns. And then you have your French vocabulary, like if you're having a science lesson, you might have your vocabulary about centigrade or Fahrenheit or whatever you're teaching that day. I love Talk, it's a great project, and And communication is just integral to relationships and friendships. My favorite topic is valued social roles. And there's actually, and we have this salmon sheet here, and it talks about valued social roles. So there's a branch of social science called social role valorization, which I learned about a few years ago. And it basically says the more roles you have in society, whether it's, employee, citizen, neighbor, brother, friend, bowler, guitar player, the more roles you have in society and the more other people perceive those roles to be valuable, the better you will be treated and the better quality of life you will have. It's a fascinating subject. But, we like to use that in our project to say, are the students with disabilities, do they have valued roles? Do they participate in the same way as their peers? And do the things we have them do, are they considered cool? A perfect example is, say you're doing job training and you decide that you're going to have students with disabilities pick up the trash. That's not that valuable of a social role, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with picking up trash, and I think that if you were doing it with other peers without disabilities, it would be fine. Are they getting to have any choice in how they participate, and are they getting to do different roles over time? I really like the second to last bullet point. Does everyone have the opportunity to both give and receive support? Because students and people with disabilities in general are often kind of the designated receivers of help. And I know I took Jake one time to do a volunteer thing where we were filling up bags of rice for Haiti, I think. And he did it with a group from Parks and Recreation Therapeutic Rec, so it was people with disabilities. But I'm like, this is great because, they're used to getting the help and now they're actually helping people. And it feels good to do that. And everybody should have a chance to do that. So, we just need to think about this when we're assigning roles. And some of the ideas for valued roles in the school might be volunteer experiences, either in the school or sometimes off campus. We love service learning projects because, there can be an academic component as well as a hands-on component. There's usually a lot of roles, if you're talking about doing something or making something with your service learning. Just leadership responsibilities. It doesn't mean you have to be the president of something to have a valued role, but you're a member and you're contributing, and that's a valued role. And then, you can think about this in the classroom too and assign roles and just making sure everybody has a valued role and a way to participate. And so, the next building block is prepared students, and that's all about the orientation, and that's kind of a step in each of these interventions, which I'm going to talk about, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but what do students need to know about one another, and what do they need to know about the activities they're doing together. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when I do each of the interventions. And, the just enough support, I don't think I put the, just enough support refers to, adult support usually. And so we want to make sure that we're not over-supporting them and there's no room for the peers to get in there. Here's a little cartoon here. It says, Joey noticed a mysterious force field around his assistant that children could not break through. And I've also seen cartoons where there's the little island in the classroom with the parrot, and it just sometimes having too much adult support, can decrease the contact with other students. It also can be stigmatizing, and it encourages dependence. So how can we move students into some of those roles? And I love the peer advantage. Peers are the experts on social skills. Kids know what's cool in the school. Peers are not stigmatizing like adults can be sometimes. Peers help each other all the time. So, and they usually are quite willing to do it if you ask. And also, peers benefit. We have some research that shows students that support another student in a classroom in a peer support arrangement. If they're A and B students, they stay A and B students. It doesn't bring their grades down. If they're C, D, and F students, it actually increases their grade by a letter to a letter and a half when they participate, which is amazing. And why is that? They got to pay attention so they can help the other student. They're more vested, they have a valued role. So it's a great thing. And then, of course, when we talk about projects that we do, we always have to evaluate them to see if they're having the intended effect. So this just refers to, let's look at it occasionally, evaluate it, and see how it's doing. So as I said, we go through this exercise with the schools, and then we kind of go into the interventions. And I showed a little bit of that video. Unfortunately, you couldn't hear it, but that kind of introduced the peer networks. And so I'm just going to briefly go over it again. I know we've talked about it. So a peer network is a social focus group established around a student with a significant disability. They meet weekly. What do they do at these meetings? A lot of times they're eating lunch. A lot of times they're doing what all other teenagers do, and they're talking to each other. If there's time, especially if it's not a lunch thing, and I think elementary schools may have a little more leeway. A lot of times they do a shared activity. It could be a game. I had a girls' network up in northern Kentucky that the student with a disability loved to paint nails. So they set up her network around, they called it Nail Salon, and every Friday she and a couple of her peers would get together and paint nails, and teachers would come in and get their nails painted. It feels great. And a lot of times maybe a boys group may want to shoot baskets in the gym. So, it's kind of student-led what those students are interested in. And hopefully, you've used your interest inventory and found students that have something in common. And the third thing that we want to make sure we do at these peer network meetings, the facilitator should lead, help them discuss where they might see each other, where they might have seen each other the week, in the intervening week since the last meeting. And at the end of the meeting, talk about, are you guys going to do anything this weekend, or will, do you see each other in class? It doesn't have to be, we're going to go out and go to a meeting and get pizza. It could be, we get to see each other between third and fourth block because our classrooms are right next to each other. So we want to always make it go outside of the network meeting and try to expand. Why do we do it? It encourages the student to become, I like to call it the true life of the school, where people know you and you know people, and you're known in the school. There's people that can say hi to you. And maybe people in the network, you can meet other people that way. And also, sometimes it helps students get involved in extracurricular activities, or even things during the school day. Say if there's a pep rally, maybe the network's going to get together and make posters for it or something. So it's just a way to get the student with a disability more involved like their typical peers might be. And the facilitator is there to kind of guide the group and just be there when problems arise. They're a little more involved in the beginning, in the first few weeks, but then they kind of step back as the network kind of starts flowing on its own. And of course, with younger students, you're going to need maybe more support. But that's kind of what a peer network is. So you'll have your focus student, you'll have a number of peer partners, 3 to 6 peers, and the facilitator, which I said could be any adult in the school. We actually also have some schools that use outside facilitators, community members, and that's a great resource too. It's great for like a retired teacher. They had, I think, a librarian, youth pastor. You do want to make sure that those people have their background checks or whatever the school requires. And then, the special educator, even if they're not facilitating the network, they're going to be involved in the planning. Aren't these cute little...
Yes.
The parents may or may not be involved. Ideally, they would be. And then, that related service guys, kind of odd looking.
Is that no teeth?
It could be. Could be. So what are the steps? Well, and again, this PowerPoint is taken from that video, so you can always go back and review the video, but these are kind of the steps. You need to plan it first and figure out who's going to be involved with planning. You've got to prepare a facilitator, choose and prepare a facilitator. You have to identify peers and invite them to participate. You have to hold an initial orientation meeting. And then after that, you just hold the network meetings. And of course, we always want to reflect and see how things are going. So, you know, when you're planning a network, number one, which student should you start with? And we recommend, you know, a student that may have a few friends and may primarily interact with adults. But it could be, you know, it could be any student with a significant disability that needs, you know, help with relationship building. You know, you've got to figure out what time of day, where you're going to meet, what activities you can do. You've got to think about who would be a good facilitator for this group and any barriers. And of course, we actually have a planning form that we go through with schools. I'm not going to make you guys go through it. But, so preparing a facilitator, you know, who would make a good facilitator? Like I said, it's great if you can get some of the young, popular people involved, the coaches, you know, teachers that students really like. It can be a community member. We've had some very successful community members doing it. We need to talk about, you know, how are we going to prepare this facilitator. And again, we go through a lot more detail of this in our all-day training. So what are they, you know, how do you get somebody to agree to do that? So what might a facilitator help you with? They might help you identify peers. Oftentimes the special ed teachers don't know a lot of the, you know, general ed students. They're going to help with the orientation meeting. Again, the special educator may be involved in the orientation meeting. Of course, they're going to be there during the meetings. And a lot of times the meetings might be in a teacher's classroom, so that could be convenient for them. You know, they're going to coordinate with the special ed teacher and just check in with the students and make sure everything's going okay. And so, you know, what do we think about when we're looking at peers? Actually, I think the next slide. Peers would share interests and or hobbies in common. Peers that have maybe shown an interest in the student, you know, maybe they may already be some friends that they want included in their network, or at least acquaintances. You want them to show up to school on a regular basis, you know, because you don't want to miss on the network meetings. You want to have generally positive behavior. It doesn't have to be the best behaved students. It doesn't have to be the best academic students. But people that are personable and can get along with other people. And I really like this, peers who are themselves on the margins, because this can be a great intervention for the peers as well. In one of our schools in Danville, the middle school teacher purposely chose peers that had barriers. You know, they might be students in poverty or students that have different issues. It's great if there's a new student that just moved into the school, because it can be a way for them to get to know people. So we don't always have to look at our top students for things like this. Which peers have a lot of friends that they can be introduced, because hopefully we're going to expand outward from the network. And of course they have to have the same, you know, they have to have the same lunch period if it's going to be during lunch. You know, this presents problems for some schools that when their schedule changes, if they have, you know, trimesters. We have a school in E-Town that they run a trimester system, and everybody's schedule changed completely 3 times a year. So it was really difficult for them to maintain their networks because their lunch periods would change too. So that's just some of the things to talk about. So after you've, you know, chosen your facilitator, you've got some peers that said they'll do it, and everything. You need to orient the students, the peers, the student with a disability, and also the person that's going to be the network facilitator. So, you know, what do they need to know about one another? It's a great thing to do, like actually there's the next slide on that. So, you know, what do they need to know about what they're going to do? What do they need to know about the facilitator, and what don't they need to know? You're probably not going to discuss diagnoses, you know, at these meetings. So here's some of the things, a typical meeting. You know, you might have an icebreaker activity if the students don't already know each other. Sometimes they may already know each other. You're going to talk about the goals of the group, and you know, I like to just talk about it in terms of this is just a fun group for friendship. You can call it a peer network if you want to. It doesn't matter, whatever you think will work for your students. And we like to talk about, what do we have in common? We have some similar interests, but also what makes us unique. So, help each student talk about that. We want to talk about confidentiality and respectful language, not in the sense that we're going to educate students about confidentiality of written records or anything like that, but it's kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. If something embarrassing happens in the network meeting, don't go talk to other people about it. That's not cool. And using respectful language, and you may need to educate some students. Talking about getting together outside of the network, and then, by this time, you've probably already set the meeting time, so you don't really need to discuss about it. And then just ask them if they have any questions. So that's what an orientation would look like. And once you do that, you just go to having the meetings, and the peer networks are kind of easier to conceptualize and plan and go through as compared to the peer support arrangements. It's just a little more planning involved, because you've got to look at the IEP goals and all the academic stuff. But one thing that a facilitator may do in some schools, they have some kind of app where you can just remind people that something's coming up, and it's not like a text where they text back, but you can send them a reminder, hey, peer network today at lunch, make sure you come. And then the facilitators are just maybe in the beginning going to set up some activities, set up some topics of conversation, and then as time goes on, meetings tend to kind of run themselves. So what are some activities? One thing we want to think about is, are they age appropriate activities? And one example that we have used at the very beginning was coloring. If a student likes to color, maybe instead of coloring in a coloring book, you make posters for the next game. But since then, like adult coloring has kind of become a thing, so that might not be, that could still be considered age appropriate. You want to make sure that all the members are somewhat interested in it, and we call these our interests with autism perseverative interests. So if your student has I don't even like to say perseverative interest, but if they have a overwhelming interest in something, hopefully you can find other students that are interested in that, and if not, maybe there's a way you can make it work to entice the student to enjoy the network meeting. And it doesn't have to include their interest. It can, but if possible, it's great if you can do that. You provide opportunities for interaction. Maybe your student's not verbal. You want to make sure that they're supported with their communication device. Have a role for everybody. Again, the communication modes. And, you're not going to start a Monopoly game in a 30-minute network meeting, so you have to be very cognizant of that. But I tell you, I've been to some network meetings where these kids came in, ate their lunch, and did a craft, and then only 25 minutes have gone by. So it can be done, but it's there's not unlimited time, of course, in the school day.
Patti, I'm a little confused
Yes.
about, you talked about two different models, two different ways to go.
Peer networks are the social model. That's the one I've been talking about now.
Yeah.
The peer support arrangements are actually the thing I'm going to talk about
So you haven't
next
done
in the
that yet.
classroom. Yeah.
Yeah.
But is there any questions so far on anything I've talked about? Yes.
Is it tough to get involvement with boys as peers? I mean, you kind of imagine if we've got more boys.
I mean,
than girls
typically-
on the spectrum.
Typically, we think of the girls when we think about anything in school,
Yes.
sitting next to somebody and helping them.
Yes, being
You're going to go
helpers.
to your students that make the good grades, and you're going to go to your girls. And Dr. Carter talked about that in our first round of trainings. I don't know that it's really hard to get boys involved, because we don't, as a project, we don't really do that. The schools do that.
Yeah.
But what we do know, or what I've found, is a lot of times people just have to be asked, because one of the things we go through is how do you get the peers, and you might do a school announcement, but people might not be paying attention to that. So I think the direct approach when saying, hey, we're setting this group up and we think you'd be a good part of it. So that's a good question, and I don't know if schools have not told me that they had trouble with that. And sometimes you might want to have all boy groups or all girl groups. Oftentimes, especially with the older age groups, it's going to be a mix. But again, it's all just up to what's appropriate for that student, what works for the school. So,
What if you have someone that really gets overwhelmed, is nonverbal, and has a lot of anxiety and
right.
has a meltdown or has some kind of...
Or conveys that they're not interested in it.
Yeah.
I mean, we have had situations where the student does not want to do it. You know, you've tried to get them to do it, you've explained it to them, you've let them try it. And if they're not interested, we're not here to force them to do that, you know. But I think of a student that had a lot of sensory issues, you know, of course you'd want to make sure that it was a quiet room. You might want to have 3 peers instead of 6, you know. You might even start out with 2. I mean, our model calls for at least a minimum of 3 peers, just because it's not the peer support arrangements. We don't usually typically have as many peers, but in a friendship circle, there's typically going to be more. But also, we do have networks that are facilitated. I know by speech therapists. It may, you know, an occupational therapist may actually be a good facilitator for a student like that. And maybe the activities that you're going to have are going to be very physical activities, if that's what the student prefers, or outside time. But it's very individualized.
If you focus on the special interests of the individual, but they're okay with that, but then they're not connecting with it. That means
Where
that
they just want to,
they just are doing their thing,
Yeah.
you know, is there built-in kind of ways to, I'm not saying this right, but ways to kind of help them to kind of at least be aware of other individuals, you know, that are in the room, you know, that are attempting.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think what I would say about that is that wouldn't be something that would be unique to our project, and you would use whatever strategies that you've used on that student before. That's a good question.
I think what you might be asking is just, at some point, are they interacting with the peers in the group? And what I have found is through the icebreaker in the beginning is helpful. And even if during the craft activity or during the whatever they're doing individually at the Angelique time to share about it, then they do get that interaction in that way.
And that's one of the roles of the facilitator, is making sure that all, not just the student with a disability, but that's probably the one they're going to be focusing on, that they are participating.
I mean, they're usually, while they're working, still kind of asking everybody, you know, what's your favorite cake? What's your favorite cake? And then they can share other information to get to know each other even while they're working, sometimes depending on what the activity is, not just cake, but what you did this weekend,
Right.
or what's your favorite sport,
Right.
or
And you know, you can do something a little more formal where maybe you have a conversation jar, or you know, everybody goes and shares something about themselves. But that is kind of one of the roles of facilitator, is to try to make sure. And you know, I would think if a student was not participating and not enjoying themselves, you probably would reach out to your related service providers and just see if they had strategies, or the teacher of the student. And maybe, you know, in the beginning you have another adult support in there, just focusing on that student. But it's, now we don't have like, if this happens then you should do this kind of thing for those types of situations.
I love it that you're, if I'm understanding it, that you're looking at the baseline to have a very significantly involved individual.
Right. We wanted for the most significant students to be able, the students most significant, I can't talk right now, impacted by their disability. Yeah. So, you know, some things to talk about. We recommend schools start small. You know, start off with 1 network, maybe 2 at the most to start with. Same with peer support arrangements.
Each network has one individual with disabilities.
Right, right. Have teachers talk to other teachers about it. That's a great way to have it spread to other, so more students can be involved. Document your successes. And maybe you're not going to start with your most difficult student. Maybe start with a student that has these needs, but you think will have it, so you can start off with a success story. Here it says peers will be the best recruiters of other students. So if you got one or two peers, say, think you can get one of your friends to come? Would they be interested in this meeting? And make sure you are regularly, evaluating and see how things are going. So our next intervention, so that's peer networks. It's the social piece. It's once a week. It's pretty easy to conceptualize. The peer support arrangements, just because it's all this academic stuff, it's in the classroom, and you've got to think about, what the needs of the class are, what students are expected to do in that class, what are the students' IEP codes. It gets a little more complicated. And I was going to show this other video, and so I've hidden a bunch of slides in here. Just wondering if there's any. So let me just see if there's some of these slides I really want to talk about. So these are actually these are all schools in our project. Oh, okay, so in the, what Dr. Carter talks, and I've hidden these slides because I thought I was going to have Dr. Carter talk about them, so I can't make it the full screen or they'll go away. But we talk about where students with autism spend their time. And like I said, in our regular big trainings, we don't focus on autism, but on these modules, we're focused on autism. So we look at other disabilities in the other trainings. So I think this talks about where students with autism spend their time. Can it get any more in focus than this? Do you know, Joe?
I don't think that's an issue with the.
So, these students in the blue, I think it goes up to about 30% or 35%. And this is, over time. Those students are in a regular class for 80% or more of the day. The students in green are in regular education class 40 to 79%, I think. And then the rest of the students are mostly special education. Yeah, except for it's a hidden slide, so what's going to happen when I go to the next slide? It is showing. Okay. Anyway, this is just another way to look at it.
Is that the one you want?
This will work. Make it work. So in peer support arrangements, we're talking about students with significant disabilities that may spend a lot of their time in a special education classroom. So we're not really talking about these students that are already in general ed most of the time. We're more talking about these students that are mostly special education classes and bringing them out of the special education classroom into general ed classes and providing appropriate supports. So these are some of the things Carter talks about. He does, like I said, he does a lot of great research. And so one thing they did was they just went and observed students in a classroom. And these are all students with disabilities. The green, the dark bars are the number of interactions students had throughout a school period. I think it's the percent of intervals that they're having interactions. And so you can see they're having a lot of interactions, but these little green bars represent the amount of time they're interacting with other students. So you can see they're having a lot of interactions during the time, but it's almost all with adults. These two here only had interactions with adults, and we're thinking, well, they probably have the paraprofessional right next to them, and they're that's why they're having so much interaction with adults. Well, Sam here, he doesn't have a lot of interactions, but more than half of them are with peers. So that's some of the data.
Is this a homogeneous group? I mean, are they all have the same level of communication ability? Are they all the same?
You know, I'm not, honestly, to be honest, I'm not sure about this research, because I was going to have him talk about it. And actually, I'm usually the one that presents the peer networks, and Luann, who is a former special education teacher, she usually does all this. So unfortunately, she's not here today because it's her birthday, and I said I could handle it. So I'm sorry I don't have the information.
No worries.
I think it's just in regular classrooms, though. And here's some of the other data. Another observational study looking at in a classroom that has both students with and without disabilities. You know, the students without disability, the peers, so the green is students with disabilities, and they're having a lot of social interactions. Students with disabilities are having far fewer. I was kind of surprised that, you know, they're academically engaged 80%, 83% of the intervals. I was really surprised that I was kind of surprised students without disabilities, frankly, were that high. And I was, you know, so we were surprised with both of those numbers. And then if you look at adult proximity, and I'm sure they defined that as in a certain amount of feet or something. You know, the peers are never in adult proximity, whereas students with disabilities half the time. So this is some of the data that's kind of led to the development of peer support arrangements. And then we also talk about elements for inclusion, which, as you'll see, are very similar to the building blocks. And I am going to go back to... So now we go back to this. They're very similar. The important elements for inclusion are very similar to the building blocks for friendship. The main difference is in a classroom you're not necessarily going to try to have students with common interests. I mean, it'd be good if you could, but you're more going to focus on proximity to peers rather than common interests. Because, you know, the peer networks are more of a social thing, so you want to have people with common interests. So what is a peer support arrangement? So, like I said, I think the peer networks are a lot easier to conceptualize, so I'm going to stumble through this. Luann's the one that usually does this. But so a peer support arrangement is when you have usually a peer with a significant disability, usually 2 to 3 peers. The reason we don't like one peer is just because what if the student is absent? What if they're absent for the whole week? If you have 2 peers, you're more likely to make sure you have somebody. And 3, you don't probably want any more than 3, but you know, a table of 4 where they push the desks together with 4 students, that could be a peer support arrangement. And I'm really glad Luann got on the project with us because she's coming from a teaching background. And she kind of introduces to the language of a community of learners. And so, you know, when you're talking to the students about this, you're not saying you and you are going to support this person because they have a disability and they need help. You're going to talk about it, we're a community of learners, we're going to help each other learn, support each other. And like I said, it has to be in a general education class. This is not an intervention that takes place in a special ed classroom. So what do the peers do? What do peers do for each other? They support participation in class activities, provide feedback and encouragement, just like any other peers would do, you know, in that situation. And it can be the students with disability providing the feedback as well. You're going to model communication, and that's, I mean, pretty much having a conversation is modeling communication. That's how people learn to talk. But sometimes if the students have higher communication needs, the peers might need to know how that AAC device works. Help with task directions. Oh, you're supposed to be on page 14 or fill out 3, 4, and 5 on the sheet. You know, can say, hey, you need to finish that up. She's going to take up the paper soon. And then just promote interaction. So there's a social piece also in the classroom, as we know. What's coming up next? Oh, and now we get the little thing, the focus student, a couple of peers, and a paraprofessional. Oftentimes there's a paraprofessional that helps facilitate. Special educators are always going to be involved, even if they're not in the classroom. They're going to be involved in the planning and be there for advice and stuff. And that's supposed to say the classroom teacher. Somehow the words did not make it. And then you might have your related service providers involved. I think that's it. So how do you do it? Well, the most important thing and the thing that takes the longest is doing the plan. And when we're doing these all-day trainings, we actually walk the school teams through this, help them think about everything they need to think about. And then you're going to prepare the paraprofessionals, or if there's not a paraprofessional, the facilitator may be the classroom teacher or a collaborative teacher that's in there. You're going to, identify the peers. You're going to do the orientation, very similar to what we did in peer networks. And then supporting shared work, that just means be in the classroom together and go through, and do the activities and do the learning. And of course, we always want to evaluate and see if we're being successful in our efforts. So this is very long. I'm not going to read you everything on here, but this is just how peer partners support each other in class. And this slide may need a little bit more of the "we're a community of learners" thing. We've tried to take away the us and them language in our training. We're supporting them instead of saying that. We're supporting each other. But, they can sit by each other, share notes. It makes sure that you have your books, make sure you can check the accuracy of each other's work. There's just all kinds of things that students kind of do without us writing down everything they have to do. But there's just a lot of ways that they can support each other. And these are some sample academic supports. Sharing materials, adding examples, repeating what the teacher said or summarizing things. But also, the social things that peers can do to support each other. Help them fit in, encourage them to introduce them to other students. Offering emotional support. We do that for each other all the time. So, and students with disabilities need that too. So reinforcing, inviting them to do things together. Just helping them have a typical school experience, which is often not necessarily available to our students. So there's a couple of different approaches that we talk about in our training. So we look at, during a classroom, you might have lectures, you might have small groups, you're going to have seat work, and you look at all these different components of the class, and what are the typical activities in the class? And of course, that's going to vary with every single class and every single teacher. What do they do? What are their routines? What are the expectations for all the students? And what supports can we put in place for students with significant disabilities? So that's kind of one way of looking at it. This is kind of the one that we usually build the training around. It's also looking at the different things that may take place during the class. We also look at the beginning in class. What do students do? Does that teacher have a bell ringer where students are expected to come in and start working? Or does this teacher let students chat together? And in that case, what can the students with autism do during that time? And you actually write everything down. You write down what the peers can do, and then what the facilitator can do. I think there's an example on here, and I believe this animation got a little wonky there, so I'm not sure. So we have this peer support plan, and you can't really read this very well, but this is the same categories. At the beginning of class, lectures are large group instruction, small group, independent work, and at the end of class. And we have them, I think there's some animation with this one.
But all those things those questions you answered, do the students have to follow along that, what they're allowed to do at the start of class or whatever? Or is the facility just use it?
part of the reason for the exercise is to just to get them thinking about this and spending the time to put in to do it.
Who?
The teachers, the school, the team that's doing the planning. And just to think about, what is this going to look like? So, you know, when you're doing the training for the peers, I mean, some schools might actually write down things that students can do with each other. Like I said, and this is still kind of in the us-them thing. But this is not something we would show to the students. This is something we would show to the teacher and the facilitator. So, you know, at the beginning of class, Stephen needs to, and I don't know why say hello to peers is down at the bottom, that should probably be at the top. They can say hello to each other. They can talk about things, they can get the material, you know, get any materials they need. Here's what peers could do to help Stephen. And then the facilitator can encourage the students to interact with each other. A lot of times what the facilitator does is redirect, because people are so used to talking to the adults and not the other student. You know, what does he like to do? Well, he's sitting right here, why don't you ask him? So, anyway, this is very necessary to do all of this work, especially when you've never done a peer support arrangement before. And it's going to probably take longer, but after you've done a few of them, you can go through them pretty quickly. And that's just another example. So during small group activities, Stephen can listen and follow directions, ask questions, you know, make sure he records all their notes if they're doing a lab or something. Talking about how peers can help Stephen do those tasks. And then talking about how the adults can facilitate that. Is that your?
It's mine.
Oh,
I was gonna say.
I was gonna say, yeah, did I just start my computer?
What about when we have like, a lot of people that we see where I work, they have limited resources, and so
Right.
there might be obstacles, like they might smell, or they might have.
The students themselves.
Or they don't dress like other children or other youth in the school. Do you guys kind of address some of those? Or they might have habits, like they might pick their nose and,
Okay.
you know what I'm saying? They might do some things
That is a turn off to other
that
students,
turn
kind
on
of.
to other kids. How do you, because those are obviously the obstacles
To friendship.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you guys, I mean, does the facilitator assist in kind of helping to navigate that so that
Well, when you say you train peers,
We have them do an
so that's
orientation.
probably something you cover in that, like you
We
talk
don't
to
really
them
talk about like bad
Yeah.
hygiene or
Yeah.
anything.
when so-and-so does this,
somebody
just
has
don't,
acne or,
how to react.
Yeah, maybe like how to respond. But that's, I mean, when I think about that, that's more like a behavioral thing. Like, you know, when Stephen bangs on the table like that, he might be upset, so, you know, back up, give him his space. Or, you know, if he touches your face, it means he liked you, but you can tell him, please don't touch my face, those sorts of things. So, yeah, we would recommend talking to students about those things. I don't know how you get around some of the things you're talking
Yeah.
about. But one of the jobs of a facilitator is to interpret behavior. And we do have, actually have one of my packets from, we were talking about the facilitator. We actually have this really good handout, which I don't have extra copies of, but of facilitation strategies. And what I really like about this is that it actually gives examples of things you can say. So this is a really good thing to share with facilitators and paraprofessionals. That's a good question, Mel.
But I don't see that is isolated to peer support. I mean, this would
Right.
be
This would
across
be-
the board
right.
anyway, and the teacher and parents and everybody would be handling that, so it wouldn't just be addressed in that.
but that
peer
would be a reason
arrangements,
why.
But it would be a
It would be a barrier. It could be a barrier for
It
sure.
would be a barrier.
Yeah.
I mean, and the way even the way you dress, if you're not cool, I don't know what word that they use now.
Well, and you know, it can actually be, it can actually help students to learn compassion.
Yeah.
Not necessarily just in your example, but when they get to know these people that appear to be very different and get to see their gifts and what they bring to the table. We do year-end surveys every year, and the students themselves rate these interventions very highly, and they say things like, I made a friend with somebody I never thought I would make a friend with. So it's pretty gratifying in that way.
I remember when our son was in middle school and because I asked the teacher, the special ed teacher, to see if she could find out from peers what things Jay, our son, did that were kind of obstacles. And this is
Off-putting to the students, other students.
Yeah, and one of the things that he does is he picks and eats at the skin around his fingers, and that was a big obstacle to the non-disabled peers.
Because they just thought it was too odd.
Yeah, they thought that was kind of, was weird,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And even if I think of all the interesting things about Jay, our son, the behaviors, there goes confidentiality out the table, but just all the things that he does that are just unique things about him, that was the thing that the young people came up with, and I thought that was so interesting.
Did you have an idea of how to address that? Because I know sometimes he wears those gloves.
That's when we started trying to kind of cover a Band-Aid, because I just wanted him to have friends. This would have been right after we'd invited everybody in his class to a birthday party, and nobody showed up. And so I'm like, okay, this is a concern. And so I just wanted to begin to understand from a young person's perspective, that hangs out in the same environment, that what was it about him that would cause them to not be interested in being his friend? And that was something that was
one
the
of
key
the
thing that
things.
came up, and I'm like,
interesting.
okay, it is what it is.
But,
Yeah.
familiarity really does improve social situations, I think. So this is one way that not only can you maybe make a new friend, you can learn a lot about people's differences and people's commonalities as well.
But you see, you have to look at it from two sides, because in Wald's case, he would say to the peer, why are you wearing that? It smells. Are you sweaty today?
You stink.
Yeah.
Oh, and I remember when my son was, I was worried about him being bullied. And then he became really fascinated with this kid that had his ears really stuck out. And I'm like, oh my God, now he's the bully. But he was just kind of fascinated by it, So, crafting the plan is a huge thing, and it's not something that I've covered adequately today because we just don't have time. But that's probably the main thing to ensure the success is not just throwing the students in there together. You really have to plan for what it's going to look like, and then you really have to prepare everybody, And so oftentimes a paraprofessional has been used to going maybe to a general ed class with a student with a disability. And one of the things we found is that if you ask a paraprofessional to completely change the way they're doing their job, it's kind of scary for them. Because they've always felt like their job is to be there and help that student. And if an administrator walks by and they're not sitting by their student, they're going to think they're not doing their job. So we actually prepared a whole new training for paraprofessionals on shifting. We started to call it the changing roles, but you're not changing the roles, you're shifting the role. Because the role of the paraprofessional is, the way I look at it, is to support the students and to support the teachers. They're still doing that. It's just going to look a little bit different. So it can be, there might be some resistance because of that, because they're just not used to it. That's not how they've thought their job works. But let's see. So I mentioned this, and I can email this to anybody that wants it, but facilitation strategies. So one of them is just make sure the peer partners are are sitting together. And you may have to remind, especially if it's a student that likes to get up and wander, you need to sit with your peers. And what else? And then just to check in and see how things are going. But there's a whole piece on social interactions and academic support, because you're supporting both of these things. And Dr. Carter also did some research on this. And he found that the role of the facilitator is to prompt social interactions, to reinforce social interactions, and just to provide information about, and this is like maybe interpreting the behaviors, provide information about what you're supposed to be doing for social as well as academic. And so he did some research on training people on peer support arrangements, and then had some, he's at a Vanderbilt, so I'm sure he has lots of graduate students that are going out and doing these observations. And they found that of these three things, there's one thing that really needs to be done or the intervention does not work as intended, and that is the reinforcing. You guys are doing a great job working together. I really like how you've completed your work together, this sort of thing. So that's a really important piece, and that's addressed in this with some examples of what you actually would say. So if anybody wants to take a look at that, or I've actually got a couple of copies if somebody wants that. And then, like I said, we're not changing the roles, we're shifting, and we're not shifting the role, we're shifting the practices, because the role is still to support students and to support teachers. So, when you look at things the paraprofessional can do versus what the students can do, there's going to be some things that you're never going to ask a student to do. You're not going to ask them to monitor IEP goals. You're not even going to show them the IEP. That's not something the students need to know about. You're not going to have them monitoring behavior other than what students typically do. Hey, pay attention, we're going to get in trouble because you're talking too much, But we're not going to be asking students to be behavior monitors. We're definitely not going to have students do any sort of toileting, grooming things. That's still the adult's role. And we're not also going to ask them to modify instruction. Although students often have great ideas and you can modify things on the fly. But these are things that the paraprofessionals will continue to do. The things that we're going to shift is sitting right next to the student. You're not going to be the one doing that. That's going to be another student. Being the first person to answer a question, you're going to redirect and say, "Oh, I bet Joey knows that. He's sitting right there and he's really good at that." We're not going to be the ones reading to students. A peer can do that. And, a peer can say, "Oh, we're working on number 17 now." The facilitator doesn't need to do that. Walking everywhere with the student, peers can do that. And if there's some safety concerns, you need to address that. But it's not a default that a paraprofessional is going to always be walking with a student with a disability. Keeping a student on task and helping and telling them what's next. Besides these other things, the paraprofessionals may be helping other students in the classroom. And they're also going to be monitoring and doing these facilitation strategies and, encouraging students to do some of that. So that's the part of, preparing the paraprofessionals. So we've made the plan, we've prepared the paraprofessionals, and now we are going to identify peers. And, we've already talked about some of this. They don't have to be the best students in the class. As a matter of fact, it might be better to have a more average student to provide some of that support, because they're going to benefit perhaps more than a student that, is really a top-notch academic kid. So we're always going to hopefully, let the student have some say in who they have to support them. On the other hand, Jake would have just chosen the wildest kids in the class. I would not have let him be able to choose, his peers. Students that have expressed an interest in the student before, again, we want them to be there, have consistent attendance. If possible, shared interest, but since this is a classroom, where, it's more of an academic focus. So if they don't have shared interest, that's okay. Good interpersonal skills, a good role model, So those are just some of the things, you know, to think about when you're trying to look at. The number one thing, which I've actually put this on another presentation, is the number one thing is they have to be also enrolled in the class. So again, this is not a peer tutoring thing where we're pulling a student to be like a mini teacher. There's nothing wrong with peer tutoring, but we think peer support arrangements are better.
They don't get anything like points towards
No, the students that are.
beta club or something like that.
Right, whereas if you're doing the peer tutoring model, a lot of times they're actually getting credit in peer tutoring. So that's, you know, when you're thinking about inviting peers. And then the orientation, you know, very similar to, I'm keeping an eye on the time, it's 8:11, okay. You know, you're going to talk about more about the classroom goals rather than just about friendship. You're going to also talk about confidentiality. We don't talk about negative things. And then, of course, it's going to be different with each class that you have a peer support arrangement in, because it's going to be different topics, different teachers, different peers involved. So you do need to talk about what the teacher expects, communication systems if that's an issue, when to seek assistance, that's a big one. So that's the orientation, and we actually have, one of them's on the website, we actually have developed these really short PowerPoints for students. You know, say, oh, you're part of a peer network, and just a very, like 8 or 10 slides each. And we have one, I believe the peer support one, I think, is on our website. This is something I'm doing this week, is I have to go update things on the website. But we have one for peer networks and one for peer support arrangements, if schools choose to use them for their orientations. And then, you know, and then you just get to the running the class. And like I said, we've got these facilitation strategies, and there's two different things that we found in some of Dr. Carter's material, and we couldn't decide which one to use, so we just, you know, used them both. But this is the one where you're, you know, prompting, reinforcing, and providing information, and then on this side you're, you know, modeling ways to interact, highlighting similarities. You like country music? I think Todd likes country music. So you're talking about things they have in common. Identifying strengths, you know, and these are just also kind of the reinforcement kind of things that facilitators can say. Interpreting behaviors, you know, I know we talked about that. You know how you give someone a high five when something goes really well? Anna expresses her excitement in a different way, usually by rocking back and forth. So the facilitators can help interpret behavior, redirecting interactions. And, you know, you might have to do that for the peers and the students with disabilities. If you want to know how Jack is doing, just ask him yourself. He's right here. And then, you know, so it works for both students with and without disabilities on the redirecting. And increasing proximity also is another thing we want to be aware of. They need to be in proximity to their group. So let's see, what's next? I think we talked about that already. So, like I said, the peer support arrangements, they're more work in the beginning, because you just have to plan for all these different classrooms, and everyone's going to be different. But, you know, you also need to consider who's going to make the adaptations, and how are they going to, you know, how are they going to communicate that, especially if teachers involved. Things that they just need to think about, you know, you need to think about as a team ahead of time. Who's going to train them and give feedback? Who's going to collect the data? What is the plan for dealing with inappropriate behavior of the students with disabilities or the peer partners? These are just ideas we have that, you know, the school teams think about. And so we call that supporting shared work when you're in the classroom. Is there research support for this intervention? Oh yeah, Dr. Eric Carter, it's Eric with a K. He is a very prolific researcher, and I'm not gonna read all this to you, because I'd like to leave a little time for questions at the end. But if anybody has any questions about the research findings, the benefits to the students and the benefits to the peers. That's one thing we really like to emphasize with schools, is that this is not just to help the students with disabilities. This helps all students in the school. And through our yearly evaluations, and we've also just finished a project evaluation. I just lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that? I was going to say, they talk about it's really changing the school culture and improving the school culture. So it benefits everybody in the school, and so there's some things on peer networks and there's some things on peer support arrangement. This this should be in that video that I told you was on our website. Some thoughts on getting started. This is the same with peer networks. Start with just one or two. Don't try to do all your students at once, because we've had schools try to do that and it did not work. Is there a teacher you really like in the classroom, if it's a special ed teacher? Who's another teacher you work really well with? If you can get maybe a student in their class, if it's appropriate, and show this early successes. So I think I was also going to show the website, and that's where those videos were. So this is just interesting. And this was for when we were talking to schools. I'm not going to make you do an evaluation either, but we do that at our trainings. Website. What is that? Okay, I'm on YouTube. All right. So here's our website. One of the things I'm going to change, well, I'm not going to talk about that since I'm being recorded, but so this is our website. We have, our homepage kind of talks about both of the interventions, peer support arrangements and peer networks, and some of the benefits. But then we have separate pages on peer support arrangements, peer networks, and there's also some videos, which if we have time after questions, I'll be glad to show one of these videos. They're about 5 minutes. There's one on peer support arrangements. Oh, I'm on the peer support arrangement page. So this goes into a little more detail about peer support arrangements. The same thing with the peer network tab. There's actually 2 videos on here. This is one just strictly on peer networks, what they are, how they work, and it shows some footage of students in a peer network. But we also have a video, I think it's on here, yeah. This is a student that is on the TALK project as well as in a peer network. And this is just a little video about his network. This is his facilitator, who this is a community member, Mr. Chidester. And so those are, and they're like no more than 5 minutes long if you want to look at those. But what I wanted to show you mainly is we have this page on resources. And they are divided up, peer support arrangements, all these things are there. Lots of things in this packet. There's a lot of resources on there. And so they're divided peer support and peer network. Did you pass out the green and blue?
No.
Because the green is all about peer support arrangements and the blue one is on peer network. So I'm going to let y'all each take one of those. So then we have this section on tip sheets, which these are 4 of our tip sheets right here. We have 6 altogether. We have here's one for school staff. So if you were going to do this intervention and you wanted to educate everybody in your school about it, there's a tip sheet on that, and there's also one for parents. So those are our tip sheets. What else was I going to show you? These are our modules. So like I said, the autism cadre modules are the ones that I was hoping for you guys to hear as well as see today. These are developed in conjunction with the Kentucky Autism Training Center, but they're not really exclusive to autism. It's a lot of the same concepts. These particular modules are just kind of with a mind toward people with autism But it's very similar stuff that you would use with other students. Let's see if there's anything else in the resources I wanted to talk about. Did you already pass it out? Oh, I thought you
Told me to
passed.
send
Oh,
me
I thought
this.
you were passing it. Yeah, you can pass out the interesting inventory too. And then if you just want to go straight to the resource, you can see all our videos. They're also reproduced here, all three of them. So, did I leave you with more questions than answers?
No, this looks
You have questions?
Now, here's the bad news about our project. I only have a job till June 30th, so our project is ending, but we're on our second additional year. So it was a 3-year project that we're gonna get almost 5 years out of. It was a 3-year project, but we didn't get started. It was gonna be a 2.5-year project, and then we've got an additional year twice. I don't think we'll get another additional year. But we're leaving the website, as our legacy and trying to get everything updated. We're always updating it, but, by June 30th, it's gonna be, we're gonna get all the resources as good as we can and leave them there for posterity. Now, if anybody knows of a funding stream we could tap into, we could.
And DD Council's funding it?
Yeah, and we've already got 5 years on it, so I don't think we'll be getting it again. But,
Are they working on looking for a grant there?
I mean, I don't know if anybody's actively looking. It's really hard to get projects funded on an ongoing basis. Have you found that being at a university?
Yes.
So, one of the things we've tried this year, unfortunately, one of the kind of bad things is that we have found over the years that if the key person that's really driving this and pushing a school to do it, there is a lot of turnover in public schools. They get a job in a different school or a different district, and the project kind of tends to go by the wayside unless the school's invested a lot more people in it. So what we're doing this year is we're doing some district sites and trying to train people in the whole district, so if one person leaves, it can still carry on. And we actually are looking for another district to partner with us, if you guys know any school people that would be interested in doing that. What else? Any questions about anything?
Why, so I think that it's probably been running roughly overlapping 2 different Fayette County superintendents and 2 different special ed directors. Why, and I assume you've talked to Manny Cock about it, or someone else?
I have not talked to him directly. We've had Fayette County schools come to our trainings. So when I talk about the pilot site schools, that's a very few schools. We've trained probably close to 200 school teams. I was counting it up today. We've trained over 900 people and probably a couple of hundred schools. The only ones we really follow are our pilot site schools and we have learned a lot from our pilot site schools. This training really looks different than it did. I know it's confusing, the difference between peer networks and peer support arrangements, but in the beginning it was very confusing. So do you guys think we've done a good job of separating? Because that was a big problem in the beginning. So we've learned a lot from our pilot site schools, and I'm hoping that other schools are, if they're not doing the full-blown intervention, they're taking pieces of it and making it work.
So what I'm wondering is, why do you think Fayette County wouldn't come on board?
I couldn't really say.
You were asking that?